What does it mean to call someone a terrorist? And, while we're at it, what does it mean to call someone a woman? We're going to get into it. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. This is one of my favorite videos so far in the series that we're doing on Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle, a book I almost just threw across the room. We are covering today chapters 7 and 8, and that means we're talking all about terrorism and gender, or more broadly, categories, because you may look at those two things and go, Justin, why are you trying to cram these two together into one video? That is lunacy. Why are we trying to do this? We're gonna get into it, I promise. You will see the connection between these two things as we look at these two chapters. Before we dig into it, a quick reminder to like, subscribe, comment, all of that good stuff. Thank you so much if you are already a subscriber on the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. This whole book series is free for anybody who wants it, and that Patreon subscription really goes a long way to helping me continue to make these videos. So thank you so much for being there. And this is our second to last video that we're going to do on Freedom is a Constant Struggle, which is a short book but offers us a lot to talk about. So today in this video, I'm mostly following the structure that is laid out in chapter 8, which is Feminism and Abolition, Theories and Practices for the 21st Century, which is a speech that Davis gave at the University of Chicago. Now, of course, we are also covering chapter 7 today, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about chapter 7 at the end of this video, because from first glance, it may look like chapters 7 and 8 are radically different, and I want to kind of make the case that actually they're very much in dialogue with each other, but we'll get to that much later. But enough with all this prologue. Let's start by talking about terrorism. And okay, you have seen this name all over this book. If you're reading along with this video series, you have already seen this name pop up all over the work of Angela Davis, and I'm willing to bet if you are at all involved in leftist causes or you do some leftist reading, especially contemporary modern reading, you have seen this name pop up before. It is time for us now to talk about Assata Shakur. Assata Shakur is an activist and former member of the Black Liberation Army. She was convicted of murder after a shootout on the Jersey Turnpike way back in 1973. Shakur actually very dramatically ended up escaping from prison, and she fled to Cuba. And from the very beginning, Shakur's conviction was pretty suspect. We won't go too deep into the case here. You can read around about Assata Shakur's case. Just truly start with the Wikipedia page and then immediately get off the Wikipedia page because, listen, there's a lot to this story and a lot of detail that Angela Davis herself gives to this, so it's worth kind of reading around if you're very interested in Assata Shakur and the way that she was held up as this kind of perfect target of terrorism, this hunt for terrorists in the United States, and why a black woman would inhabit this role. We'll talk a little bit about that as we come to it. I do just want to mention kind of the broad strokes of what happened with Shakur and her conviction. And there are a lot of elements to this, but one of them is the fact that experts testified that Assata Shakur could not have shot anybody because she was herself shot in the back. Her arm was paralyzed. She couldn't have lifted the gun because she was shot in the back with her arms raised. Davis also points out that analysis that was done on the scene showed no traces of gunpowder on Assata Shakur herself. And there's a lot more to this case, but immediately just from those two main details, you might think, okay, there's some room for doubt here, right? And innocent until proven guilty, all of that stuff. It didn't matter. It didn't matter at all in the case of Assata Shakur. And that's because Shakur had ended up becoming something of a poster child for the FBI. So the FBI at this point had decided that she was a terrorist, and so she had to go down for it. And then in a pretty wild twist, remember this was back in 1973, this original shootout on the Jersey Turnpike. In 2013, so a good 40 years later, the FBI adds her to the 10 most wanted terrorist list. And again, this is after almost 40 years of her living peacefully in Cuba. It's an absolutely absurd stunt, and it prompts Angela Davis, who has experience being on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. A little bit of a distinction there because they didn't break out the official 10 most wanted terrorists list until much later. So Angela Davis and Assata Shakur we're not technically on the same. It doesn't matter. But Angela Davis is prompted because of this to ask, why is it always necessary to put a black face on terrorism? In the same breath, in Chapter 8, she mentions the Boston Marathon bombing and how everybody afterwards, this whole industry of amateur sleuths going out there to try to figure out who the Boston bomber was, everybody started with this imaginary suspect who was a black man in a hoodie. And the bombers, of course, ended up being Caucasian. Now, I actually didn't remember this specifically about the Boston bombing. It wasn't a story that I followed terribly closely in the immediate aftermath, so I went to look it up and found a New Statesman story that called the hunt for the Boston bomber a racist Where's Wally, which is the British version of Waldo. So yeah, fair enough. But there's a broader issue here, and the broader issue is that there's a need for people in power to identify violence, especially this type of kind of terrorist violence, with a black face or a minority face or a face that is excluded from the seats of power. So you have rigidly defined hierarchies of power, and anyone who is marginalized from that can be put as the face of terrorism. And places like the Southern Poverty Law Center have repeatedly made the point that most domestic terrorism in the United States is committed by white people, the natural inheritors of the Ku Klux Klan mentality. So why come back in 2013 and put Assata Shakur on the 10 most wanted FBI terrorist list when there's actual terrorism going on within the United States and it's committed by white people? Well, because it's helpful to put a marginalized face on this kind of terrorist act. Remember back in Chapter 6, we didn't talk about this at the time because I wanted to save it for today, but in Chapter 6, Davis mentions the expansion of the term terrorist during George W. Bush's War on Terror. It was a broad and expansive definition, and it was also a helpful definition. We've talked about this before on the channel because really the term terrorist just means an enemy of the Western world. It's framed as an enemy of Western democracy, which isn't really democracy. It is, of course, Western capital. That's what this actually means when you read just barely beneath the surface. And in that chapter, back in Chapter 6, Davis said that the use of the term terrorist, this designation, justified anti-Muslim racism, it legitimized the occupation of Palestine, and it channeled military surpluses into police departments, which is still a reality we live with today. And it was, in other words, incredibly helpful to anybody in power. But while we are talking about categorizing and defining people, we should switch to the other side of this, which is talking about gender. And Angela Davis starts from the premise that the latter half of the 20th century was a bitter struggle to define who counted as a woman. If you look at the feminist movement of the time, it was, prior to that, very much a struggle of middle to upper class white women. And so black women and other minority women had to really fight to be included in this movement. And that is what the struggle was about, the one that Angela Davis is referring to. And black people and other minorities were excluded from the struggle for exactly the reason that Angela Davis is laying out here, because of this system that we have already described. Feminism was a white bourgeoisie struggle. Anything else was apart from that. Now, because of the civil rights struggle that kicked off really properly in the 1960s, more groups of women started to be added to this broad definition of what counted as a woman. And then, Davis says, there was one woman, her name is Sandy Stone, who just broke the category wide open. If you don't know Sandy Stone, it is really worth reading around her work. It is absolutely fascinating. Davis says that Stone wrote some of the germinal texts in what became transgender studies. And that, honestly, if anything, is an understatement. And Davis selects her, favorite issue to talk about, which is, of course, prison abolition, and looks at it for us here very quickly through the lens of transgender studies. And it's really, really fascinating because Davis basically says, listen, scholars are now wrestling with the question of prison abolition and gender nonconformity, because it is at its core really an intersectional argument. Trans women of color often end up in male prisons. They often end up as the targets of sexual violence. Meanwhile, the institutions themselves engage in violence and encourage violence within them. And added to all of this is the fact that very necessary hormonal treatments are most often denied. And we have seen Davis already talk about how prison abolition is a deeply feminist idea. But now she is adding a very clear queer theory element to it. And that should make a lot of sense to us because there are interests and concerns and violence that affects and touches every community that the prison industrial complex reaches into, which is to say, basically everybody. But there's something more here, and it's about gender itself. It's more specifically about this idea of female and femininity, but Davis says, okay, listen, trying to assimilate people into a category sometimes just isn't enough. It may be important to add trans women to the broader category of women, but it's actually insufficient. And then Davis says something that is, at its core, incredibly radical, especially for such a foundational feminist theorist. But she says maybe the category itself of woman needs to change. And here Davis is laying down a really fascinating argument for fluidity. She says, listen, if you look at a bunch of different people who are examining this issue, if you look at academics and activists, for example, they often fight for very hard categories, and it makes sense why they do that. Academics are trained to fear the unexpected, and activists want something concrete to fight for. And so you want a very hard category. You don't want something that is fluid and shifting because then it is hard to write an academic argument about them, or it is hard to build a true activist campaign around something that you're not really sure how to identify. But, and this is the power of Angela Davis, feminism has always been about something so much more than simple gender equality. And this takes us back to the classic intersectional arguments that Davis has been throwing at us this entire time. And it's why she is such a brilliant scholar on this issue. And it is because the concept of gender itself and femininity is rooted in conventions and assumptions that need to be, at their core, upended. And maybe to truly understand an issue and a struggle, we need to allow ourselves to luxuriate a little bit more in categories that aren't as hard and fast, if that makes any sense. What we're really pushing here is categories that are expansive and allow a multitude of struggles in a million different directions and a million different combinations. And that really is the intersectional struggle. Davis has this quote here, and it's a brilliant quote. She says, feminism involves so much more than gender equality, and it involves so much more than gender. Feminism must involve a consciousness of capitalism. I mean, that feminism that I relate to. And there are multiple feminisms, right? It has to involve a consciousness of capitalism and racism and colonialism and post-colonialities and ability and more genders than we can even imagine and more sexualities than we ever thought we could name. I, for one, absolutely love this idea here. The idea of the incredibly expansive category, the idea of resisting this hard and fast categorization. I think there was a time when this was incredibly helpful to an activist movement, and now I think it is actively pushing back the other way. I do think that to lead a modern struggle and a movement, and not even a modern struggle, this has kind of always been the case, but especially now, we have to recognize that we are all kind of fighting in the same direction. If that makes sense, and of course you can comment and reach out to me directly if you have quibbles or if you do agree with this kind of interpretation of categories. Queer theory and transgender studies and all of this is in many ways quite new, but also very, very profound. And so there are a lot of different ways you can go down this route, and I just beg that it's not the route that leads you to J.K. Rowling. That's pretty much all I want. But to come back a little bit to Angela Davis, I did say we'd talk more about Chapter 7 early on, and this is where we do need to talk a little bit about the universal category, because if we're talking about helpful categories, right, it's helpful if you can categorize a terrorist as something that is outside of the power structure, and it's helpful if you can categorize a woman as white bourgeoisie, we should say. Then shouldn't we resist that? Shouldn't we embrace the universal category? And Angela Davis is here to tell us that the universal category has some issues to it. Now, Chapter 7 is about violence in America. Chapter 7, we did cover a lot of it already, and there's a bit of it that will also be covered in the next video, the ones where we talk about chapters 9 and 10, so we will come back to some of this. But while we're talking about categories, let's hit this issue of the universal category and how we define and sort people into categories. And I want to mention this point that Davis makes because Davis in chapter 7 is talking to people in the wake of Ferguson. Specifically, this is 1 year on from the murder of Michael Brown and the giant protests that erupted in Ferguson. So it's a very, very raw issue when she's speaking. And one of the very cool things that she does right at the start of this chapter is that she says, I'm not here to offer leadership, I'm here to offer thanks. And that's exactly right, because the Ferguson protesters, I mean, movements not just in the United States, but also around the world, they kept this laser focus on what really mattered. And then she jumps into some of the rhetoric that started popping up post-Ferguson, and you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about in a sec. Because Davis is specifically calling out Hillary Clinton, but we heard this from everyone. And it was an answer to this cry that Black Lives Matter, and Hillary Clinton goes out and says, well, all lives matter. And it's from this that we get the clandestinely racist universal category idea. There is this thing that starts to happen, especially to a movement, when it starts to sound like an intersectional argument. And it's leaders, especially political leaders, coming out and saying, yes, of course, we should care about this issue. But there's a lot more to care about at the same time. That may, at very first pass, sound intersectional, right? No, of course, there's we have to help Black people, but there's so much going on, right? There's a broader movement here. That's not intersectional at all. What it is quietly and deeply racist. So when Hillary Clinton came out in the wake of the Ferguson protests to say that all lives matter, what she was doing is moving from the category, right, Black Lives Matter, to the universal category, the clandestinely racist universal category. All lives matter is a meaningless designation, and it serves to just quash a movement in its tracks. That's the entire point of this. It is whatever you want to call it, right? A dog whistle, a capitulation to the right, a capitulation to racist United States. Anything you want to brand it is probably true, and it is because it is steeped in this language that sounds so powerful, right? All lives matter. Of course we should care about this movement, but really all lives matter. That's not the point of this rhetoric. This rhetoric is a signal of racism. And Davis says, and this is dead on, that if all lives actually mattered, we wouldn't need Black Lives Matter. But we do. And that's just something to consider as we continue going through these arguments about categories, that there's a very insidious side to this kind of universal struggle language a lot of the time. These are broad struggles. They involve multiple groups that intersect at all times. We are all, to some extent, hurt by this brutal capitalist system that we all live under, but all lives matter is not an argument, it's a rhetorical device. I'm going to close this video about this chapter here, but because Angela Davis ends chapter 8 by letting Assata Shakur have the last word, Assata Shakur, by the way, very much still alive, very much still working, and very much still a powerful figure, I'm going to also end with that same Assata Shakur quote. Just so, you know, if you haven't read this essay, and I recommend that you do, by the way, do definitely check out this book. It's really, really awesome. But if you're just following along in the videos, just so you can see this quote here, we will end on it and repeat it here. She says, "I am not so concerned about myself. Everybody has to die sometime, and all I want is to go with dignity. I am more concerned about the growing poverty, the growing despair that is rife in America. I am more concerned about our younger generations who represent our future. I am more concerned about the rise of the prison industrial complex that is turning our people into slaves again. I am more concerned about the repression, the police brutality, violence, the rising wave of racism that makes up the political landscape of the U.S. today. Our young people deserve a future, and I consider it the mandate of my ancestors to be a part of the struggle to ensure that they have one." And that's Assata Shakur in her own words. Really, really unbelievable. And if you do get a chance to read around some of her work and writing, it is absolutely worth it and absolutely fascinating. I mean, all of this is absolutely worth it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, tell your friends, all of that. Check out the Patreon, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. I will be back next week, stumbling over my words already. I'll be back next week with chapters 9 and 10, the final video. And then if you are on that Patreon subscription, you will get a final wrap-up video, which is everything you need to know about this unbelievable book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. So definitely check that out if you're over there. And that's it. I will see you next week. Thank you so much for watching. See you then.